Now, before we start utilizing React testing library, I think it's very worthwhile to introduce some of the most common types of tests that you will be utilizing to test your application. Now, there's many different types of tests, but here on the screen, I have the three most common ones. Now, in this crash course, we are going to be covering unit testing and integration testing. But I'm quickly going to introduce what end-to-end testings are and why they are very useful. If you want to learn about end-to-end testing, I actually have a crash course on my channel about Cypress.js, which covers end-to-end testing. So let's actually go ahead and let's start with unit tests. What are unit tests? Unit tests are tests that test a piece of code, a component in complete isolation. And let me just quickly illustrate this to you by going back to our React app. So let me go over here and just quickly refresh this. And I want you to pay attention to this over here. This right here is actually its own component. And the number is dynamically rendered based on a prop that is passed in to this component. So essentially what's happening here is we add a to-do or a task, and whatever the parent component of this child component is going to calculate how many to-dos we have, and then it's going to pass that number to this component as a prop. Now what we can do is basically test this component in isolation. We can say, hey, for this component, if we pass 5, for instance, we should expect that 5 tasks are left is rendered in this component. If we pass 1, then we should expect 1 task left. If we pass 0, then we should expect 0 tasks left. And that right there, because we are just testing this component in complete isolation, separate from all of the other components, that right there is a unit test. So we're just testing that single unit right over here, the single unit in complete isolation. All right, so that is unit tests, and we will cover that in this crash course. Now let's talk about integration tests. Now most likely, your React app is going to be interacting with multiple components. For instance, over here we have this input component, and over here we have this list component. Now when I go ahead and I type this, well, I'm typing in one component, and then when I press add, it adds into a separate component. And actually it also updates this component. So what we could do is test the interaction between components. So for instance, I can test and assert that, hey, when I type something and I press add, I expect it to appear in this list. And because these two components are interacting with each other, then we are going to be doing integration tests. Integration tests basically test, hey, how are these components working together, and are they working together properly? And again, we will also be doing integration tests in our crash course. The last thing is E2E tests, and this is something that we won't cover. And this is end-to-end testing, and it really simulates what the user is ultimately going to do. So for instance, let's say that we have a login feature, and once we log in, maybe we have a questionnaire, and then you get prompted to this to-do. And what we ultimately want to test is, hey, once I add something, and press add, I should see it on this list. With E2E tests or end-to-end tests, we basically test the beginning to the very end. So we test the login process, we test in the questionnaire process, and then we basically test in, hey, the adding process, and then seeing if it renders. And E2E tests are very, very important because they simulate the user flow, and they really test every single feature in our application. Now with React Testing Library, you don't typically write E2E tests. That's typically handled by something like Puppeteer or Cypress, which is very, very popular. Again, I have a crash course on my channel about Cypress if you want to learn it, but in this crash course, we're going to cover unit testing and integration testing in great detail.